Hello, everyone. The story I have for you today is in the genre or category of historical fiction. That means historical because it's about actual people, although it's fiction because not all the people in the story were actual. Some of them the author made up to tell the story because we don't know all of the conversations and people that they met. So, today we start The Bandit of Ashley Downs, the story of George Mueller by Dave and Netta Jackson. Chapter 1, Escape from the Tower. Curly Roddy yanked open the door to the bell tower of St. George's Church and slipped into the pitch-dark staircase. The sexton was not likely to look for him here, he hoped. He held his breath and listened for the sound of footsteps. That morning, the homeless orphan boy had hurried to church early, hoping to find someone to pickpocket. Curly was not a mean kid, just hungry and in need of money for food. He had been standing in the busy lobby watching some people collect money for an orphanage when he noticed a woman walk by wearing a light gray shawl. She was carrying her purse very loosely, and Curly was certain he could cut its strings and be off with it without her knowing. He followed, pushing his way through the crowd, intent on catching up with her. That was when the sexton had spotted him. Young boys from good families didn't dress so shabbily or behave so rudely, and they certainly didn't wear their caps in church. So even though the quiet notes from the great pipe organ urged worshipful silence, the church caretaker had called out, "Hey, you, boy, come back here." But Curly had ducked down the hallway out of the old man's sight. Now, hiding in the belfry, he cautiously opened the door a crack and peeked down the hall, uncertain whether the sexton had really noticed him or not. Maybe the old man had called to someone else, and Curly had run unnecessarily. But no, through the crack he could see the sexton looking this way and that. The 12-year-old boy started to pull the door shut, then thought twice about it. Would it be better to get caught and turned over to the police, or get locked in the tower? After all, in England in 1872, unless someone died, a bell tower might remain locked until the following Sunday's bell ringing. By then, the bells would peal for me, thought Curly, 'cause I'd be dead. The old man stopped, and as if by instinct, looked directly at the belfry door. Curly could see a wry grin spread across his face as he came toward the boy's hiding place, pulling a ring of jangling keys from his jacket pocket. Well, looks as if the tower's unlocked," he muttered. Curly backed away from the door, deeper into the darkness, certain that the old caretaker would fling the door open and catch him. Instead, the sexton pushed the door tightly shut and said, "If you're in there, you little thief, then this ought to keep you from picking anyone's pocket for a while." The bolt clacked loudly as it moved in the lock. The rattling keys were pulled from the door. Then the sexton's heels clicked on the stone floor as he walked away down the hall. Curly had figured stealing from unsuspecting church members was easier than picking the pockets of cautious shoppers in the marketplace. But he had never expected a problem like this. He stood silently, trying to force his eyes to penetrate the darkness. But not even a dim glimmer came from under the door. How could a place be so black, he wondered. He groped forward until he found the door handle. Turning it was useless. The door was locked. Panic rose in Curly's chest, and he began to pound on the door. "Help! Help!" he yelled. But no one responded. After a few minutes, he stopped, breathing hard. It was no use. "I must think," he told himself, trying to calm down. "There's got to be a way to get out of this." In the eerie silence, he became aware of the deep, rumbling tones of the great pipe organ. The service was starting, and people were singing. No wonder no one could hear him banging on the door. If I'm patient, I may be able to attract someone's attention after the service. While he waited, the pinched feeling in Curly's stomach reminded him that he hadn't had anything to eat since the day before. He wondered whether Spuds Baxter, the small-time criminal with whom he stayed, would rescue him. "Not likely," concluded Curly. "He won't even miss me till I'm not around to be his lookout." Finally, Curly decided to do a little exploring. Maybe there was some other way out of the tower. Maybe up higher there would be a door leading to the balcony at the rear of the church. He cautiously shuffled back across the tiny room until his feet bumped into the wooden steps. He reached out to steady himself against the stone wall and then began climbing, counting the steps as he went. At 12 steps, the staircase turned with the wall and went up another 12 steps. When this happened 4 times, Curly figured he had made one full turn around the inside of the tower and must be at least as high as the balcony, but there was no door. Could it be higher yet? He moved quickly up another set of steps, but in his haste slammed his head into the heavy planks of the ceiling. The darkness lit up with stars, and he slumped to the steps to recover. He didn't like to think of how high he was. He could not tell if the center of the stairwell was open all the way to the floor, and in the darkness it was hard to keep his balance when he took his hand off the wall. He felt the stone wall more carefully. "I must have missed the door," he thought. "Why would they build stairs that go right into the ceiling?" Curly felt around until he discovered what seemed like a large trap door above him. He pushed, but it wouldn't budge. He turned around and backed up a couple more steps until he could duck his head and set his hunched shoulders against the trap door. By using the strength in his legs, the trapdoor finally gave way with a loud creak and slowly opened. The boy climbed out into a dim, dungeon-like room. Light was coming from windows high in the tower, through which the sound of the bells rang out over London. The bells hung huge and gaping overhead, much larger than Curly had ever imagined. Hanging from each bell was a long rope tied off to a peg along the wall. Curly looked around. Up one wall ran a ladder. They must climb that if they need to fix the bells, he thought. Hanging neatly from pegs along another wall were several extra coils of rope, some thick, some thin. Suddenly, Curly had an idea. If I had a long enough rope, I could climb that ladder and lower myself down from the belfry window. He removed his cap for a moment and pushed his curly hair, for which he was named, back off his sweaty forehead. He was a good acrobat and sometimes earned money doing tricks in the pubs. But the idea of climbing down the outside of a bell tower with a rope like a spider suspended from its web seemed impossible. Still, what other choice did he have? It was either try that or get caught when the sexton opened the door. or die of thirst. He selected a large coil of the thin rope, looped it over his head and shoulders, and began climbing the ladder. Halfway up, Curly pulled on a rung that suddenly broke loose. The jerk nearly toppled him as he clutched at the side of the ladder. Regaining his hold and balance, he glanced down just as the broken rung hit the floor below. He might have gone down with it if he hadn't been hanging on so tightly with his other hand. The scare caused Curly's legs to shake, and he hardly had the strength to pull himself up across the gap where the rung was missing. From then on, he tested each rung before trusting his full weight to it. Finally, reaching the top of the ladder, a terrible noise erupted above Curly's head. 7 pigeons took off from the bell timbers and flew out the belfry windows. The shock left the boy's heart slugging the inside of his chest. How did I get myself into this mess, he wondered, as he dragged himself up on the heavy timbers that supported the huge bells and looked out over London. Years of coal smoke had turned them nearly black. Heavy gray clouds, nearly as dark, hung so low that Curly felt as if he could reach out and touch them. He worked his way around to the front of the tower and looked down on the busy street of Bloomsbury Way, some 60 feet below. He felt a little dizzy and thought he might faint. From this side, people would surely see him. The best way, he decided, was to go out the northeast side of the belfry and drop down to the church roof. About 15 feet was Curly's guess. Surrounding the belfry and partially hiding the bell windows were stone columns, small copies of the 6 giant columns across the front of the church, which created a porch similar to that on a Greek temple. Curly tied one end of the rope to one of the small columns outside the northeast belfry window and flung the rest down onto the church roof. Carefully, the boy climbed out onto the sill between 2 columns. Then, turning to lie on his stomach, he let his feet hang down the side of the tower until they reached a small ledge. When he was balanced, he grabbed the rope and began to work his way farther down. At about 6 feet, he came to another ledge and took a break. Looking down at the church roof, he tried to figure out how he would get from the church roof to the ground. Suddenly, he realized there might not be a way if he didn't have a long rope, and the one he was using was tied securely to the pillar above. A damp breeze made Curly shiver as he tried to think. It was starting to sprinkle. I need to go back for another rope. It's the only way, he thought. He tried to climb back up the rope, but his arms were so tired that he could barely make it. When he finally grasped the sill again and was about to pull himself back inside, he thought of another solution. The rain was coming harder as he untied the rope from the smooth, round column and retied it around his body under his arms. Then he looped the other end around the column as though it were a pulley, and by letting the rope out hand over hand, he lowered himself slowly. Inch by inch, foot by foot, he worked his way down the stone tower. When the boy reached the church roof, he released the end of the rope and pulled it free of the column. When it came falling down in a heap beside him, Curly felt proud of himself. Now he had a rope to lower himself from the roof to the ground. He turned and walked toward the back of the church, looking for the best place to get down. The roof wasn't steep, but the rain, mixed with soot was making it very slick. He had no sooner realized this when his feet skidded out from under him, and he began to slide. Flipping quickly to his stomach, he clawed for a grip, but the surface was too slick. The closer he came to the edge, the more certain he was that the 40-foot fall to the ground would mean certain death. His fingernails tore until they bled as he tried to dig them into a shingle to slow himself down. Then, clank! His feet dropped over the edge. For an instant, one toe caught in the gutter, but then it popped loose. The other toe didn't even catch, and his feet and legs shot out into space. But just as he was about to pitch over the edge, his body was yanked to a painful stop. The other end of the rope that was still tied around his body had become wedged between two stones up at the corner of the belfry tower. It had saved his life. Carefully, Curly pulled himself back up onto the roof and lay very still, plastered to the edge, his toes firmly planted in the gutter. He was too frightened to move, let alone look down. How long he lay there, he did not know, but finally he realized he had to do something. He looked both ways and noticed a vent pipe sticking up toward the back of the church, very near the edge of the roof. If I can get back there, he thought, and tie my rope onto that pipe, I might be able to lower myself to the ground. He whipped the rope up and down a couple of times until it came free from the tower stones where it was wedged. Then he inched himself sideways like a crab along the edge of the roof. 1 foot out, tuck it in the gutter, slide sideways, then bring the other foot along. It was slow going, but he made progress, and by the time he reached the pipe, it had stopped raining. It didn't take Curly long to tie one end of the rope around the pipe and throw the other end over the edge. Good, it reached the ground. But in watching it fall, he started to feel dizzy again. I better not look down again, he thought. It took all the courage the boy could muster to ease himself over the edge and begin working his way down the side of the building. Every so often, a windowsill or ledge gave him enough of a toehold to take a break. But he was careful not to look down. His feet touched the damp ground just as the church organ pealed out the closing hymn of the surface. He sank to the earth, leaning his back against the stone church. His legs were too weak to move. The excitement of his escape would have been enough for the average kid, but Curly wasn't average. Having lived on the streets for the past 6 years, he had faced many frightening experiences. Survival demanded that he keep moving, and his stomach reminded him again of how empty it was. Shakily, he got to his feet, wiped off some of the black grime, pulled his cap low over his eyes, and walked around to the front of the church. If that woman with the gray shawl comes out carrying her purse like she did when she went in, he thought, I'm still gonna get me some lunch money. He waited across the street from the church as people poured out of the doors, and, sure enough, the woman in the gray shawl was among them, only now she had a young girl by her side. Don't matter, thought Curly, I'll still snatch her purse. Staying close enough to keep them in sight, but not so close as to draw attention to himself, Curly followed along Bloomsbury Way until the pair was away from the Sunday crowd. Then he snuck up right behind them, ready to make his move. It was then he noticed the woman's clothes were patched. This was no wealthy matron, and her companion was similarly tattered. The girl looked to be about 10, the same age as Curly's younger sister. When she turned to say something to the woman, Curly got a real shock. "Why, she looks just like my sister," he thought. Of course, he hadn't seen his sister for 6 years, but this girl had the same wavy blonde hair and the same little pug nose and dark brown eyes. "Ain't many gals have brown eyes with yellow hair," thought Curly, his heart thumping strangely. Most girls with blonde hair had blue eyes. Could she be his sister? He hung back, but kept following the pair as they turned a corner into a narrow street.